I'm Don Boney, and this is a video presentation of my paper and research for a PhD 710 capstone project. We're in the midst of the Great Recession of the 21st century. It's been marked by a dramatic shift in the economic fortunes of most Americans. In particular, America has witnessed an extraordinarily disproportionate increase in African American unemployment rates and a sharp decline in African American median household income. The economic misfortune of the recession has led to greater economic inequality among African Americans with incomes at the lowest levels, while at the same time individuals at the highest levels of income have prospered. This paper investigates the impact of domestic economic policies advocated and implemented by various presidential administrations over the last 30 years, and contrast those economic policies with the economic fortunes of African Americans. Now, it's generally presumed that African American employment and economic progress is enhanced by federal government economic policies that increase the size of government, expand employment in the public government sector, as contrasted with those policies that implement significant reductions in government size, public sector spending, and tax cuts. The research question of this project is, does federal domestic spending increases reduce unemployment rates and increase median household income among African Americans? The debate regarding the efficacy of federal spending on employment and unemployment rates of African Americans is both relevant and critically important. The political debate about domestic federal economic policies is ongoing, and it is a leading issue of the 2012 presidential campaign. The context of the research question of this paper refers back to the decades-old debate of economists and public officials that in times of severe economic recession, that national government economic policies should increase national domestic spending in the public sector in order to create jobs and reduce unemployment. During the Great Depression, the Roosevelt administration increased and spent millions of federal dollars to create jobs in the public sector in order to reduce unemployment. Now, in response to the Great Recession of 2007-2009, that actually continues. The Obama administration has passed a massive job stimulus package in order to reduce unemployment and promote economic growth. This research paper investigates economic policy of the federal government to study the impact of domestic spending in the public sector and to determine the impacts on the rate of African American employment and well-being. This economic public policy debate is rooted in the classical Western economic theories of a number of economists, notably British economist John Maynard Keynes, who first advocated intervention by national governments in severe economic recessions by increasing government spending and tax breaks in order to stimulate the national economy, and that the national government should enact spending cuts and tax hikes during times of economic expansion in order to curb inflation. Keynes is best known for the development of a body of economic theories that form the basis for a new school of economic thought that came to be called Keynesian economics. Keynes' theories are in fact controversial and are in conflict with the theories of other economists, among them a Nobel Prize economist that is American, Milton Friedman, who's a staunch non-government intervention advocate of free market capitalism. Friedman encourages government to minimize involvement in the economy by reducing taxes and government regulation. Milton Friedman first came to public prominence in the 1980s when he served as an economic advisor to Ronald Reagan. His laissez-faire economic theories regarding tax reduction, deregulation, privatization, and monetary policy were highly influential and were used by governments both nationally and internationally. One other American economist of note that I want to bring to your attention is Arthur Laffer, who also became prominent during the Ronald Reagan presidency as a proponent of supply-side economic theory. Supply-side economic theory purports that the best way to stimulate economic growth is by, again, lowering taxes and reducing government regulation. Some supply-side theorists have argued that, in fact, tax reductions actually stimulate economic growth to a corresponding rate so that government revenue, in fact, is the same as it would be with a 100% tax rate as it would be with a 0% tax rate. The concept there is that with a zero imposition of government taxes, the economic stimulus and economic activity would generate the same amount of government revenue as taxes at the highest levels. Supply-side economic theory is associated with trickle-down economic theory. Trickle-down economic theory asserts that tax reduction for business and the wealthy will ultimately trickle down to the poor members of society and thereby improve the economy for the whole. These economic theories pretty much form the theoretical framework for the domestic economic policies of the last 30 years, implemented and advocated by various United States presidents. Now, inevitably, economic theory is not the only framework for national domestic economic policy. Inevitably, other political concerns and special interests will also impact and shape economic policy. Now, after reviewing the domestic economic policy framework of various United States presidents over the last 30 years, I will use census data and economic reports on the unemployment rate, the median household income, and poverty rates to assess the impacts of these various national economic domestic policies on the economic status, the economic well-being of African Americans. Going back 30 years ago, we have the economic policies of Ronald Reagan. In fact, Ronald Reagan's economic policies were so dramatic that they were described as a radical departure from the previous modern presidential administrations in the 20th century. His policies were called voodoo economics by his Republican rival for the nomination, George Bush, but grew to become so popular that they formed a new school in economics to be called Reaganomics. Some described his economic proposals in 1981 as the first major shift in U.S. economic policy since the New Deal. Reagan's supply-side economic policies were embodied in his simple declaration: only by reducing the growth of government can we increase the growth of the economy. Reagan's domestic economic policies can be summarized in 4 main points. 1, reduce the growth of government spending. 2, reduce tax rates on income from both labor and capital. 3, reduce regulations. 4, reduce inflation by controlling the growth of the money supply. Those 4 core elements form the foundation of Ronald Reagan's national domestic economic policies. For the most part, his successor, George H.W. Bush's domestic economic policies were a continuation of Ronald Reagan's. However, about 2 years into President George H.W. Bush's domestic economy, the economy faltered in the United States and a recession set in. So that brought into question the supply-side economic policies of the 1980s. And President Bush, facing mounting federal deficits, record federal deficits, determined, along with the Democratic Congress, that there was a need to raise federal taxes. President Bush then broke his campaign promise of no new taxes in order to try to address the problem of federal government deficits. By 1992, the last year of the George Bush administration, the budget deficit of the federal government was $340 billion. The national debt, which was less than $1 trillion when Ronald Reagan assumed the presidency, was more than $4 trillion by the time George H.W. Bush left office and turned over the reins of power to Bill Clinton. Clinton's economic domestic national policy was based on these 3 points. 1, establish fiscal discipline, eliminate the budget deficit, keep interest rates low, and spur private sector investment. 2, invest in people through education, training, science, and research. And 3, open foreign markets so American workers can compete abroad. After 8 years, the results of Clinton's domestic economic policy were clear. Record budget deficits became record federal surpluses. 22 million new jobs were created. Unemployment and core inflation sank to their lowest level in 30 years. And Americans enjoyed the greatest, longest economic expansion in U.S. history. The overall unemployment rate during the Clinton administration dropped by half to 4%, a 40-year low, while the United States economy, again, created tens of millions of jobs. During the 8 years of the Clinton presidency, the economy expanded by 50% in real terms, and by the end of his tenure, the United States had a gross national product of $10,000 billion, 1/4 of the entire world economic output. The booming U.S. economy brought economic benefits right across the income spectrum. In fact, the stock market grew even faster by more than 3 times, creating thousands of millionaires among middle-class stockholders and employees of fast-growing companies. But of course, the growth was not evenly distributed. When Clinton left office, George W. Bush assumed the presidency. His national domestic economic policies were very much like Reaganomics, supply-side economics. During his first years, he had decreased and cut taxes in 2001 by $1.35 trillion, one of the largest tax cuts in the United States history. The unpaid for tax cuts combined with a dramatic increase in national security spending following the 9/11 tragedy created the largest federal deficit in the history of the United States. By the time George W. Bush left office, over 500,000 jobs had been lost, marking the largest loss of jobs in the United States in 34 years. The Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that in the last 4 months of 2008, the last 4 months, 1.9 million jobs were lost. And by the end of 2008, the United States had lost a total of 2.6 million jobs. Now, what we want to do from this point is begin to evaluate the impact of those various national domestic economic policies of those United States presidents over 30 years, and assess that and evaluate that policy in relation to the impact, the economic outcomes for African Americans. The first slide in the PowerPoint presentation I prepared is a visual representation on a graph of unemployment by race from 1954 to 2006. The most notable aspect of this graph, and at the top in the dark black line, you see the unemployment rate for African Americans. And the lower line, light gray, is the unemployment rate for white Americans. Between 1954, coming out of and still in the midst of the struggle to end Jim Crow segregation, legal discrimination, segregation against African American people, all the way to 2006, and particularly looking at 1998, which is just after the midpoint of the Clinton presidency, when unemployment was at its lowest level for African Americans. We can see that in virtually every instance, the curve on the graph shows that African American unemployment is essentially double that of white unemployment. During segregation, after segregation, during the calamitous times of the Reagan years, when unemployment among African Americans reached its highest rate back in 1982, to its lowest rate in 1999, 2000, 98, 99, 2000, during the Clinton years. And now it is curving back up to, again, that 16% rate, which is still double the 8% rate of unemployment among white Americans. So despite, in fact, the improvement in the employment rate, the decrease in the unemployment rate, the bottom line is that African Americans still are unemployed at least double the employment rate of white Americans. In the next slide, again, you see the same chart colored with a little bit more stark comparison and contrast. Again, going from 1980, when we see a peak of black unemployment, approaching nearly 20%, white unemployment at about 7, 8%. Again, black unemployment more than twice as high as white unemployment. Again, looking at the low point in terms of black unemployment rate after the Clinton years, still black unemployment twice, double that of white unemployment. And again now, as we approach 2010, white unemployment at 8.7%, black unemployment at well over 16%, twice as bad as white unemployment. So the finding here is that whether we assess or evaluate the national domestic policies of Ronald Reagan, George Bush #1, Bill Clinton, or George Bush #2, the unemployment rate for African Americans is effectively double that for white Americans. The next bar graph that we're looking at actually compares and contrasts earnings and employment by occupation, race, ethnicity, and sex, with various categories of employment compared and contrasted against ethnicity and gender. The reality is, again, that white men and women in all categories fare better than black men and black women. And African Americans are overrepresented in the lower economic levels. These next slides indicate the distribution of employment by occupation, stratifying occupation by management, sales, natural resources, production, and service. As you might expect, African Americans are overrepresented in the service industry and jobs, and underrepresented in management, professional, and related jobs. And among African Americans in professional, management, and related positions, black men are the most underrepresented category. And of course, white men are overrepresented. So when we look at closely at the unemployment figures, we cannot escape the reality during good times or bad times, Republican or Democratic presidents, doing conservative or progressive national economic domestic policy. Although African American economic outcomes may improve, they will still be, at best, half the positive economic outcomes for African Americans compared and contrasted against white Americans. And the negative, the unemployment rate, will always, so far, historically, remain double than the unemployment rate for African Americans. The next category that we want to consider after unemployment is the whole issue of poverty. Now, poverty statistically is defined by the United States Census Bureau as a percentage of income. And again, looking at the United States poverty rates by race or ethnicity from 1959, again, in the midst of Jim Crow segregation, to 2010, we can see that in the middle of Jim Crow segregation, Brown versus Board of Education, 1954. This is 1959. And so we see that African American or black poverty is about 2.5 times that of white poverty. White poverty in 1959 being represented in this census data at about 19%. Black poverty, poverty among African American families, at a bit over 55 or 56%, about 2.5 times, 2.5 to 3 times that of the white poverty rate. Hispanic poverty rate somewhat under they only began keeping census data for Hispanics about 1971. Prior to that, they were largely counted as white. We see the overall poverty rate of all Americans, again, slightly higher than that of white Americans, just in terms of average. But again, we see this continuing parallel of no matter how far up or down the poverty rate goes, African Americans are, again, 2.5 to 3 times more likely to live in poverty than their fellow white Americans. Poverty in the United States is different for different groups in the population. The poverty rate represents an average over the entire population. Blacks and Hispanics have poverty rates that greatly exceed the average. The poverty rate for all African Americans and Hispanics remained near 30%, both during the 1980s, during the presidency of Ronald Reagan, who of course advocated tax cuts, the reduction of size of government, the reduction in federal government spending domestically, as well as Clinton, who was a moderate and progressive, but in fact indeed reformed welfare, managed federal spending. The poverty rate remained essentially the same, very near 30%. At its best situation in 2000, this would be, in fact, the end of the Clinton presidency. The American public, in the midst of the greatest long-term expansion in the United States economy, the poverty rate overall in the United States dropped. The poverty rate for African Americans dropped to their lowest level historically. To 22%. However, we see now, in the midst of the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, 2010, and continuing, that the poverty rate for both African Americans and Hispanics has again risen to about 27%. And so in 2010, the poverty rate for African Americans was 27.4%. The poverty rate for Hispanics was 26.6%. The poverty rate generally, on average, for all Americans was 15%. Again, the poverty rate for African Americans and Hispanics almost double that for the average American. The causes of poverty, three main causes of poverty in the United States: poverty generally in the world and society, the operation of the political and economic system in the United States, which has tended to keep people from poor families poor. And we see again the poverty rate, the black poverty rate in America through 2008, from the times of segregation, gradually decreasing, still at 1998 and 2010 at about 26–25%. The final category that I wanted to evaluate national economic domestic policies in comparison with the policies that were advocated and implemented by various United States presidents was that of median household income. Median household income is census data that is generally used to evaluate the economic status of families in the United States. Here we look at the median household income by race for African Americans and Hispanics between 1967 and 1999. The bottom line being that the income has increased for all groups. In fact, absolute highs have been set or equaled by all ethnic groups: white, Hispanic, African American, and Asian, between 1967 and 1999. However, again, we see that there's this disparity between white median household income and black median household income and Hispanic median household income, significantly below the average for all races. And then this slide pretty much represents the bottom line. This particular graph shows the median health holdings, median wealth holdings between 1984 and 2007. It does not include home equity. So what we're seeing here is a disparity between median wealth, median household income between 1984 and 2007 between African Americans, and we see this very slight slope in the bottom line that describes the wealth of African Americans between 1984 and 2007. And we see this sharp increase in median wealth and income between 1984 and 2007 for white families. So we see the disparity. While though the condition of African American families has improved very slightly, there's a dramatic increase in wealth and median household income among white American families. And in fact, the disparity is greater. So in conclusion, I think the findings pretty much speak for themselves, that yes, it appears that there is some marginal improvement in the economic status of African American families when there is more government spending in the public sector, some increases in national domestic spending by the federal government, and when there are periods of economic recovery and expansion. But in fact, that improvement in economic status is only marginal. African American families do not really benefit to the degree that white families do. And in fact, although it's arguable that there is some difference in terms of the impact and outcome on African American economic status with respect to different national economic domestic policies of various United States presidents, that impact is in fact marginal. And the primary beneficiaries of these different, more progressive expansion of domestic spending in the public sector and increased government expenditures are in fact white families, and that the impact on the economic status of African American families is only marginal at best. And some other data that I was studying that I'll include in my conclusion, it was estimated that in order to make up the difference between the disparities, particularly with respect to home ownership, at the current rate of economic improvement between black families and white families, it would take 1,664 years, or approximately 55 generations, before the gap is closed. Similarly, it would take, at the current rate of improvement, over 1,000 years to close the gap in terms of median income. Some of the reasons that have been postured for this great difference in terms of the impact of these national economic policies and unemployment rates, median family income, and poverty rate is in fact suspected to be race. That when these economic outcomes are evaluated by gender, education, and age, this consistent unemployment gap and poverty gap maintains the same. A sociologist at Princeton University conducted a research project in Wisconsin and found that black men were less likely to be called back on a job application than white men with a criminal record. The statistics went like this on job callbacks. White non-criminal callbacks, 34%. White criminal callbacks, 17%. Black non-criminal callbacks, 14%. Black criminal callbacks, 5%. When looking at the education rate, the unemployment rate for African Americans with high school diplomas and no college education was 15.9%, while similarly situated white individuals with only a high school degree and no college were unemployed at a rate of only 8.4%. The unemployment rate of African American college graduates was 6.9%, while the unemployment rate among white college graduates is a mere 3.9%. Just a few other elements that I think underscore the impact of race in terms of economic outcomes is two trends that the past 3 recessions indicate with assessment of the unemployment data, that African Americans tend to be unemployed longer than those similarly situated white Americans, and that their unemployment rates are higher for longer periods of time. They're the first 5. African Americans tend to be the first 5 and the last to be hired. African Americans are also disproportionately affected by the loss of jobs in the public sector. So when government is in fact, public government expenditures are decreased, job losses in that sector typically have a disproportionate impact on opportunities for Americans. And so the reduction in funding for the public sector through pay freezes, layoffs, and proposed cuts, in fact, reduces opportunities for African Americans. So finally, at the end of the day, there need to be other tools developed in order to address this issue of black economic disparities. And despite the difference between and the different impact between various national economic domestic policy proposed and implemented by various United States presidents, the ultimate impact on the African American population is marginal.